Have you ever suspected that this world is not what it seems?
Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain?
Something strange?
Something extraordinary?
If not, do you wish you had?
Do you long to experience that which lies beyond the bounds of the mundane world?
Hidden somewhere just beyond the limits of our senses.
If so, then join us as we take you on a journey
That blurs the lines between the normal and the paranormal.
Welcome to Paranormalcy.
One of mankind's most enduring supernatural tales is that of the deceased lingering on the mortal plane, causing all manner of havoc for those still living. The idea of disembodied spirits moving physical objects, creating sounds and voices, and appearing as full-bodied apparitions is deeply unsettling for most. Yet, as supernatural as this phenomena seems, those with an analytical mind and the bravery to face the unknown may yet demystify this enigma. Last episode, we discussed the very real possibility that the soul survives physical death to go on to incarnate in a multitude of other lives. This time, however, we will ask yet another question. Just where does this soul of ours go between our many different lives? From my own research and direct experiences, there are a few answers to this question. For the time being, we will focus on the earthly plane, disembodied spirits, and how the two interact, and also why. Like many of the paranormal phenomena I've become interested in, I've got my own tales to tell about this one too. My interest in ghosts came about at a time when I found myself confronted with one. Many years ago, I lived in an old house in upstate New York. This house had been built by a wealthy family in the mid-1800s who made their fortune by shipping coal up and down the Hudson River. During my time there, it had long since been divided into separate apartments, all of which were occupied by friends of mine. Each had their own story to tell about strange goings-on and apparitions they had seen in their time there. While ghost stories may be frightening to some, I found that I was more curious than anything. When it comes to a sense of danger, I feel there's more to fear from the living than from the dead. Violent ghosts who cause harm to the living are stories to frighten kids at campfires and nothing more. I've adopted a saying for dealing with this particular phenomena: ghosts are people too. Because ghosts are people, well, at least they were people. And like people, they are often lost and confused. And so it was for those that haunted the old mansion I lived in upstate New York. I would awake in the middle of the night to the corner of my bed being depressed as if someone had sat there. I would sit up and look at the end of my bed only to find that there was nothing there. This would happen frequently during my stay there. One night in particular, I awoke to the foot of my bed being shaken rigorously as if someone was bouncing up and down on it. I had heard from my housemates that one of the ghosts they suspected haunted the place was that of a little girl. For some reason, I could tell that this was her. Her actions seemed to be mischievous, the sort that a small child would do to get attention. Once I made this connection, whenever she would wake me up, I would simply and politely ask her to let me sleep, and she did.
There have been various times in my life when things became suddenly more spiritually active. The veil is thin isn't a term that I particularly like, but in the absence of a better one, I'll use it. In these instances, I've met or witnessed many entities, but not all of them have had anything really interesting to say. Most of the time, it's just a person that I see standing at a counter or in a hallway when I'm out in public. Those ones don't often notice me, and I don't try to disturb them. Other times, there will be beings with angelic names like Uriel or Michael or Gabriel. These were common for a couple months in 2019 when they would seem to hang out in the corners of our bedroom or at the foot of our bed for unknown reasons. There were others who were decidedly inhuman looking, the most memorable of which was a human-shaped being whose presence was not unfriendly but woke me up out of a dead sleep. This being saw me looking at it, and it gave me an enormous smile when we made eye contact. Its skin was green and seemed to be melting off of it. It waved at me and continued on its way. One of my old apartments had a really upsetting feeling to it. It was isolated, depressed, fearful, angry, and overall just really sad. The first day that we lived there, my roommate was putting items into her closet, and suddenly they all went flying out and onto the floor. Whatever was there didn't want us there with it. Soon, I started hearing footsteps coming down the hallway at night, stopping just outside my bedroom. Then I would wake up to the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. After that, I started having dreams that something non-physical was being drawn out of me in great amounts. My physical health took a pretty sharp downturn after that. Finally, I was homesick and I was laying on the couch in the living room and I was just in and out of sleep. And I had one of these dreams again, but I woke up really quickly and a few feet away from me was just a column of darkness. Floor to ceiling, it didn't move, it didn't make a sound, it just existed. I was pretty unsettled after that and we ended up breaking our lease early and moving out.
My family has a history of strangeness. Weird phenomena would tend to follow us. Many of us even have abilities that some would claim impossible. It is one thing to be an armchair skeptic, but quite another to be actively involved. For one thing, my mother is a medium. She speaks to spirits. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that they speak to her, because that is what happens most of the time. Believe me, this is not something she asked for or even practiced. It sort of just happened one day. I'm certain that there are many that claim this ability are frauds, seeking fame and fortune. However, having known my mother my whole life, I can definitively say that she isn't that type of person. She's not even remotely capable of it. When her ability first awakened, she was in line at the DMV when the deceased loved one of the staff member behind the counter began speaking to her. Before she knew it, she had a crowd of people around her watching as she revealed details to this individual that only their deceased loved one would know. The message she delivered was so emotional that this poor employee was brought to tears. In the beginning, she would do this sporadically for people, as the spirits which would come through had no regard for schedules or planning. She eventually set up a means for scheduling and payment simply because it became necessary to do so. One only has so much free time. I can't honestly say that her abilities didn't come without precedent. Up until that point, we had been on an interesting spiritual journey. More of that story will unfold in future episodes. Suffice it to say, I've inherited some strange abilities of my own. I say all of this as a segue into my next ghost story, the cafe haunting. This cafe is one that I had worked at for many years, and during that time it was claimed to have been haunted. While no stranger to this type of phenomenon, I personally didn't feel as though the cafe was genuinely haunted. I had heard stories from a few coworkers, most interestingly of a tall man in a cowboy hat. Early in the morning, this man would come into the cafe and go into one of the private dining rooms. A waitress would then follow him in there with a menu only to find the room empty. There came a point where a group of paranormal investigators approached me to do a late-night sit-in to see if they could detect anything. After bringing it up with the owner, he agreed and allowed me to facilitate. I called upon a medium friend of mine who had been doing readings regularly at the cafe to join us, as she had experience with such things. Having worked with her for a number of years, I trusted her abilities after having witnessed them myself. I was bound to get to the bottom of this one way or the other, and who better than a trusted medium to reveal the truth? When the night came for the sit-in, I wasn't expecting much of anything to happen, honestly. After we cleaned up and closed up shop, we all gathered in the private dining area to begin our hunt. I had never been on an official ghost hunt, and I found all the young kids with all their meters and devices to be rather amusing. The medium began by leading us with an introduction, followed by an open invitation to the spirits for them to reveal themselves to us. Under the direction of our medium guide, we took our phone cameras out and began scanning the room. A common phenomenon associated with ghosts is catching luminous orbs in pictures. While this phenomenon has been explained away by skeptics, when one looks closer, it becomes clear that ghosts and the orb phenomena are intimately related. While these particular orbs couldn't be seen with the naked eye, they appeared clearly in our camera frames, darting this way and that, seemingly under intelligent control. We followed them from room to room, eventually making our way into the basement. Down there, the orb activity reached a crescendo. It seemed that we had found the nexus of activity. People that worked there would always have difficulty going into this basement. It was unfurnished, dingy, covered in spider webs. It seemed genuinely creepy, even without any haunting. While not quite a full-fledged medium in my own right, I was sensitive enough to know that something was definitely there. As we looked around, one spot in particular stood out to the medium, and she prompted me to go stand there. Upon following her direction, I immediately felt colder. I could sense a kind of energy all around me. The cameras pointing at me could see orbs gathering and swirling around me. If there were any pictures taken, I unfortunately didn't receive any. So I opened myself up to the experience and was immediately flooded with information. It's hard to explain and describe really how this transpired. Most of it was taking place within my mind, mental pictures that I could see. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman. I was opened up to their lives, and I could see through my mind's eye just exactly what transpired. The tall man with the cowboy hat had built this house and lived there with his wife. She had an affair with another man, a fact which the cowboy hat man was none too pleased with. He savagely beat this other man to death in that basement, and he died right on the floor in the very spot where I was standing. As soon as I had that realization, I looked down and could see it. I recoiled in horror and instantly moved my foot as it was essentially in the bloody mess that once was this man's head. I wasn't prepared to witness this scene, and it was all quite a shock to me. I could see the result of this altercation, and it seemed that all 3 were still present, having been caught in an emotional loop of sorts. It appears that the woman, upon witnessing this scene, had ended her own life, which, in turn, resulted in the cowboy ending his. It was 3 souls stuck in a loop together without earthly bodies to tie them to reality. They kept living the same scene over and over again. Perhaps this is why ghosts are stuck to the earthly plane. It's commonly held belief that this is the case, and I was witnessing it for myself. Once I had a complete picture in my head of what was going on, I began to speak to them. Ghosts are people too, after all, and I could see that these people were suffering. I couldn't just sit idly by and allow this to happen without at least trying to help. I don't remember what I said. Suffice it to say, I was somehow able to talk to the cowboy and talk him out of his rage, which seemed to be the main reason all 3 were still there. When I finally convinced him that he didn't have to stay there anymore, he burst into tears. It's not so much that I could hear, but just feel him sobbing uncontrollably, and it was so emotional for him that it caused me to weep uncontrollably too. All 4 of us had a good cry, in fact, me and 3 unseen. Forgiveness and love were had all around. And it was at that moment that I felt an energy, a power, another presence appeared in the room. This presence came through what seemed to be a glowing door that just appeared out of nowhere. The energy given off by this being and the light that came through the door was quite frankly the most intense I've ever felt from an invisible realm. This entity was powerful, whoever he or she was. It was impossible to make out any features as the vision was so bright. It was like seeing a glowing silhouette against the sun. I'm not sure what the medium made of this whole scene up to that point, but even she noticed this presence and gasped audibly as it appeared. This entity, it became clear to me, was here to call these people home. Just what or where that home is will be better understood through exploring my own thoughts and experiences on the matter, which we'll cover in the next episode. When the 4 of them exited the room, the glowing door shut abruptly and it was just us mortals left. The whole space felt different after that. I went upstairs in a daze. I still felt caught between worlds and was visibly affected. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It was as if electricity was flowing through me. The poor ghost hunters upstairs kept playing with their little toys, trying to prompt spirits to move a ball across the floor and other such activities. I'm not sure anyone besides me, Sarah, and the medium really understood what had just transpired. One of the more timid students who was too afraid to even go downstairs asked me what had happened. I jokingly said that I sent all the ghosts home and wasn't sure if the place was even haunted anymore. Once I collected my wits, my wife and I decided to head home. After the events in the basement, the entire building felt different, and there was no more occurrences that night. What happened after that, I'm not sure. The whole building was knocked down many years later, finally putting what was left of the place to rest. As my wife and I got home from this event, the invisible world seemed to follow us. The moment we opened the door, something that had been securely in place for well over a year fell over unprompted. Our apartment, which I'm sure wasn't haunted, was affected by various poltergeist activities for a few days afterwards.
Spirits appear in most cultures, even pre-literate ones, in various forms, and they're just as varied as human beings. There are the hungry ghosts of Buddhism, driven by animalistic needs, the vengeful Onryo of Japan, or the Scandinavian Meilingar, or improperly buried children. Women in white appear all over North America, attributed to local tragedies, and the Headless Horseman has appeared all over the world for centuries, the most famous of which is the Headless Soldier who haunts Sleepy Hollow, New York. So what are they? There are theories that overexposure to electromagnetic fields may cause some of the phenomena associated with the classic haunting. This was explored by Christopher French in an experiment where he attempted to create a haunted room by utilizing electromagnetic sources and infrasound generators. Most of the participants reported feeling odd physical sensations or presence, and sometimes even terror, but there was no hard connection that could be drawn. The connection between electromagnetic fields and unusual activity is documented, though, down to heightened and altered EM fields in the brains of people with well-documented psychic abilities like Nina Kalagina. EM fields are generated alongside electricity in the brain. If heightened and altered EM fields are being documented, that means that there is a heightened and altered activity in the neurons. Electromagnetism within the brain, the byproduct of the action pulse of the neurons, has been largely dismissed as just that, a byproduct. But it seems linked to the paranormal, to extrasensory abilities. Electricity and electromagnetism seem to be linked to consciousness, too. We see this when their activity is suppressed while under anesthesia, and we've discussed the 21 grams experiment where human bodies appeared to lose 21 grams of weight upon death. Electricity and electromagnetism have no weight, but plasma does, and plasma is by nature highly reactive to EM fields. Plasma consciousness has been a theory for quite some time, and Stanford University has completed a study which showed that human intention may be able to directly affect plasma. So what if they're all related, and we just haven't done the research? The only argument not to do it is that nobody seems interested in addressing the mind-body problem, and that ghost stories and psychic abilities are often dismissed as hoaxes by the greater scientific community because there's no body of evidence, except there is. Nina Kalagina, a Russian psychokinetic, was studied by the Soviet government for 20 years. The US Army, the CIA, and the DIA all study the potential for psychic applications in military and domestic intelligence with Project Stargate and in its sister projects, which actually fed into the private sector, as the lieutenant who oversaw that project both founded the Army's remote viewing unit and was a president at the Monroe Institute, which we've heard about before. The CIA and DIA granted funds to Harold Puthoff, a Scientologist who had achieved the highest level, who investigated people with psychic abilities for Project Stargate. He claimed that Scientology had granted him his remote viewing abilities, although he would later also claim to have cut ties with the organization. And if you're thinking that I'm focusing an awful lot on psychic abilities and not at all on the afterlife, that's correct, because I'm saving the best set of information that I have for last: the Scole experiments. The Scole experiments were a set of highly scrutinized phenomena which took place in a home in Scole, England over the course of 5 years. It was run by British mediums Diana and Alan Bennett, as well as investigators Robin and Sandra Foy. The experiments began simply with the Bennetts going into the cellar and entering trance twice a week. Soon, the spirits directed them to set up film cameras in the darkened room as well. Once developed, the film revealed faces, locations, things that looked like geographic locations from above, and a kaleidoscope of bubbles and faces which they were told were areas of communication within the spirit world. Some of these faces and personalities speaking through the Bennetts were identified by family members, and they were able to give information that only that person would know. Eventually, they were asked to forego the camera entirely and simply put a film canister in a container, which upon development would contain writing, designs, or pictures. Because this was such a wild claim, the group began inviting visitors who would be asked to open factory-sealed boxes, sign the film canister, and hold it throughout the session. This is where the Society for Psychical Research got involved. While they are believers, they are also highly credentialed, and often their membership includes scientists. They're in the business of exposing fakes in order to get to the truth. Several members and unaffiliated scientists were invited to Scole to attempt to discover the hoax, but they didn't find it, and the experiments just got weirder. The participants were asked to turn out their pockets at the beginning of their sessions, and the doors were locked from the outside so that nobody could sneak in. The participants were given luminous wristbands so that their movement could be tracked, yet during the sessions, the participants would see and hear things that were impossible. We saw colored lights, we saw materializations, we heard direct voices, that is, spirit voices coming from the air. We were touched by spirits. We saw a whole range of phenomena which could not be mistaken by 3 investigators such as ourselves, said one SPR representative. The Scole group proceeded to invite more people to try and debunk them, from leading scientists to a professional magician. They invited Marcello Bacci, an Italian direct radio voice medium who had been investigated by a similar skeptic group in Italy. During this investigation, Bacci was able to produce voices from his radio while it was switched off, with the tubes removed and set inside of a Faraday cage. And they used voice recognition software endorsed by the FBI to positively identify the voices as belonging to the people that he said they did, people who were dead. Using DRV, Archie Roy, a scientist who specializes in the movement of celestial bodies, was able to have a conversation with the spirit team at Scole, after which he said that there were only a handful of people in the country who would know what they were talking about. Meanwhile, the phenomena in the cellar got more and more powerful. There were lights which were intelligent and would respond to direction, whether expressed or silent, and which healed chronic pain and other medical conditions on several occasions. There were over 1,000 hours of continuous voice communication, and these voices were different, with different personalities which were consistent and included different accents, and could be positively identified by family members that had known them in life. The spirit team remembered every detail of every conversation for the duration of the experiment, showed that they were able to read minds, and that they were able to tell the future. There were over 80 apports of random objects, including 2 pristine 50-year-old newspapers which were proven to be genuine, based on the paper's chemical composition and the fact that it was printed in a way that had been out of use for about 20 years and couldn't have been replicated. There were spontaneous dematerializations and rematerializations, disembodied hands, faces, and arms, full-bodied apparitions capable of conversations and physical interaction, and apparitions that looked stereotypically angelic and gave off an overwhelming feeling of love just by being in the room. As for photographs, the SPR brought their own film, which was never handled by the Scole group. This film was placed inside of a locked box which was held by the representative during the session, and then it was developed by them on-site using a special machine. It never left their control, yet they continually received communication, sometimes up to 4 feet of film. These messages included poems in an old form of German, as well as Greek, Latin, Chinese, Hebrew, and even Sanskrit writing. There were symbols, designs, and diagrams, even a poem that was written by one of the founders of the SPR, who had died and promised his colleagues that he would try to communicate with them from the other side. There were signatures and initials, including Ivor Novello and Thomas Edison. Edison's initials were on a diagram of a proposed device that would assist communication between their planes, a device that he spoke about and was attempting to build before he died. Then, they were instructed to capture moving film by setting up a camera with mirrors angled in such a way that it could only film its own viewfinder. The results were videos that included a tunnel of light, people and what appeared to be a doorway, pyramids, spheres, a face with large black eyes and no hair, a stereotypically alien figure, and bubbles or color fields. Again, this happened with protections in place to keep it from being a hoax. Scientists ruled out video feedback as an explanation because it could not produce the type of images that the Scole group had obtained. These experiments had a tremendous amount of data which had been highly vetted and passed every single test. Despite everyone's best efforts, they proved themselves for 5 years, and they were able to replicate the phenomena in places other than Scole. During the production of a documentary about the film, one of the SPR representatives who had worked with the Scole group died, and a medium was able to contact him on the other side and confirm that he was just as interested in studying the world of the living as a dead person as he was in studying the world of the dead as a living person. She didn't even know who she was contacting, yet she was able to describe the way he died and the room that he had been in when he did it. Yet, no one talks about it. no one tries to replicate these studies or to prove or disprove them. There's no major scientific research going on, and there's no longer any publicly available information on military or intelligence programs like Project Stargate. Ghosts and other unusual occurrences have become things to explain away and sweep under the rug, things that skeptics and the highly educated laugh at whenever they're brought up. Within the greater context of things, knowing what we know about the research that's been done and about the body of evidence that the Scole group collected, it certainly seems that something is being done to suppress this information and make it less acceptable to explore. And this ideological subversion is a common tactic used or referred to by intelligence agencies for various purposes. In their declassified documents, the CIA seems very concerned with introducing concepts to the public which would break down the common dogmatic beliefs or cause a mass shift in the understanding of the world. They're trying to avoid a black swan event, an event which is outside of the realm of normal expectations because there's no credible suggestion that it would happen, but which would have an extreme impact on society or the world. The question is, why?
Why indeed? I have often mused over the question myself. The answer, I find, presupposes something fundamental about our world. One must ask one simple question in order to get an answer here. Just what would fundamentally change if we could speak to the dead? For one thing, it would open us up to evidence of wrongdoing beyond the grave. Imagine if mediumship could be developed enough to be admissible in court. We would have access to disincarnate witnesses to all manner of crimes, the true course of historical events, and many other closely held secrets. It would be far more difficult to get away with deceit, especially if the barrier to psychic abilities is breached. In a world of telepathy, lying is impossible. How many everyday people could handle that? Moreover, if we knew definitively that death is not the end to our existence, would we no longer fear death? Combine the inability to lie with witnesses no longer being silenced after death, then remove the fear of death as a means of coercion, and what do we get? A world without lies, deceit, and fear? It's not hard to see that those who dominate the world today use those very forces as their main weapons in their domination. It then becomes obvious why those very same powers would want to dissuade anyone from uncovering those secrets. Those secrets, however, are some of mankind's most enduring, and, in my mind, are begging to be revealed. As hinted at in the Scole group's experiments, there's a whole other world between life and death where our eternal spirits reside. In our next episode, we will complete the circle of life and death by exploring what really comes in between, the afterlife itself.
Paranormalcy is produced and co-written by Matthew Miglerisi and Sarah O'Shea. We produce our own music and our own art. To support our work, please visit our website in the link below where you can contribute to our crowdfunding, purchase the Paranormalcy book, and enjoy our art and music. We encourage you to reach out to us and share your own paranormal experiences. Our email address can be found on our website and in the link below. We would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.